The air in the police station froze as Chief Michael stormed in, his piercing gaze sweeping across the room. The smug grin on Ethan Harper's face vanished the moment their eyes locked. "Why," Michael began, his voice cold and commanding, "is my wife sitting in a holding cell, accused of theft, with no evidence whatsoever?" Ethan froze, stammering excuses that fell flat. Officers around them held their breath, watching as Michael unleashed a scathing reprimand, his fury echoing through the station. "You abused your badge and humiliated an innocent woman. There will be consequences. Count on it," Michael growled. The balance of justice had shifted, and Ethan knew he was about to face the fallout for what he'd done. But before diving into this gripping story, let me know where you're reading from in the comments below. And if this story inspires you, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next one. The city of Greenville hummed with life on this warm afternoon, its cobblestone streets bustling with activity. Shops displayed their wares in bright windows, and outdoor cafes spilled over with laughter and the clink of coffee cups. A vendor called out offers for fresh flowers near the corner, while the faint sound of a street performer's guitar drifted through the air. Children played in the park nearby, their laughter blending with the rhythmic hum of passing cars. Amid the vibrancy of daily life, Sophia walked with quiet confidence down the busy main street. She was a striking figure, her poise and grace turning heads as she passed. Her outfit was simple yet elegant, accentuated by a gleaming gold necklace that rested against her collarbone. It was a gift from her husband, Michael. Greenville's respected police chief, the necklace wasn't just a token of affection. It symbolized their bond, a love built on mutual respect and trust. Sophia's steps faltered momentarily as she caught a glance from an officer standing near the corner. His name tag read E. Harper. Ethan Harper was known for his sharp tongue and sharper judgments, often veiling his biases behind the badge. His eyes narrowed as they locked onto the necklace around Sophia's neck, suspicion flickering across his face. Ethan smirked, his mind racing with prejudiced assumptions. "What's a woman like her doing with a necklace like that? Looks suspicious," he thought to himself, his smirk deepening. In his eyes, Sophia's presence didn't fit the picture of someone who could rightfully own such an expensive piece of jewelry. Unable or unwilling to shake his assumptions, Ethan decided to confront her. "Hey, you!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the air. Sophia turned at the sound, her expression calm but laced with surprise. She didn't recognize him but kept her composure. "Yes, officer, can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite and steady. Ethan approached with an air of authority, his smirk unwavering. He gestured toward her necklace with a sharp nod. "The necklace of yours, where'd you get it?" Sophia straightened, her eyes meeting his without a hint of hesitation. "It's a gift from my husband," she replied evenly. "Is there a problem?" "Thus far, no asylum." Ethan tilted his head, his smirk twisting into something more condescending. "A gift, huh? Looks expensive. Are you sure it's yours?" His tone grew sharper, accusatory. "There's been a jewelry theft recently, and you matched the description." The accusation hung in the air for a moment, but Sophia didn't flinch. Years of dealing with people who underestimated her had taught her to hold her ground. The chemist turned and looked Jane straight in the eye. "Officer," she said firmly, her voice calm yet resolute, "I assure you this necklace is mine. I haven't done anything wrong." Ethan leaned in closer, his sneer more pronounced. "People like you always have an excuse," he shot back. "We'll sort this out at the station." For a moment, the lively energy of Greenville faded into the background. The street, once bustling and cheerful, now felt charged with tension as the interaction between the two drew curious glances from passers-by. Sophia, standing tall in the face of Ethan's blatant prejudice, knew this wasn't just about the necklace. It was about something far deeper. Something that couldn't be brushed aside as easily as his flimsy accusation. The street seemed to grow quieter as Ethan loomed closer, his smirk curling into a smug grin. Sophia, though calm on the surface, could feel the weight of his prejudice pressing down. Her hand discreetly slipped into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing against a small, concealed signal button. Designed to alert her husband Michael in emergencies, it now felt like her lifeline. Without hesitation, she pressed it. Ethan, oblivious to her actions, stood a step away, his posture rigid and domineering. "All right," he barked, his voice sharp. "Let's not waste time. You're coming with me." Sophia held her ground, her calm demeanor unshaken. "Officer, I advise you to reconsider," she said firmly, her voice steady yet assertive. "Arresting someone without evidence is overstepping your authority." Jalel. Ethan let out a sharp laugh, tilting his head as though amused by her resistance. "Reconsider?" he repeated mockingly. "I don't need advice from someone like you. You think quoting rights is going to get you out of this?" He jabbed a finger toward her necklace. "That thing practically screams stolen." Sophia's composure remained intact. Her gaze didn't waver as she met his sneer with quiet strength. "If you believe that, officer, then it's your duty to investigate, not to harass or make baseless accusations." There was something hollow, something still nature about going about the business of public Goodwick. But Ethan wasn't listening. To him, her calm defiance was an affront, a challenge to his authority. He stepped closer, pulling out his handcuffs with a deliberate motion. "Turn around," he ordered, his voice dripping with disdain. The crowd around them began to stir. Some onlookers paused, curiosity flickering in their eyes as they whispered to one another, yet no one intervened. The quiet tension of the scene rippled outward, a stark contrast to the bustling energy of Greenville moments before. Sophia exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. "You're making a serious mistake," she said, her voice unwavering. "We'll see about that," Ethan snapped, reaching for her wrist. He slapped the cold steel of the handcuffs onto her wrists with unnecessary force, his movements rough and impersonal. As the cuffs clicked into place, a sharp pain shot through Sophia's wrists, but she refused to show any sign of discomfort. Instead, she stood tall, her expression calm and resolute. Her refusal to break under his treatment only seemed to agitate Ethan further. "Let's go," he barked, grabbing her arm and steering her toward his patrol car. The signal she had sent moments earlier gave her a quiet assurance, even as she endured Ethan's blatant abuse of power. She knew Michael would be alerted by now and would intervene swiftly. Still, the injustice of the situation simmered beneath her composed exterior. "Officer," Sophia said as he roughly guided her toward the vehicle, her tone calm but edged with steel. "Your actions today won't go unnoticed. Abuse of power doesn't go unpunished." Ethan scoffed, the sound full of mockery. "Spare me the lecture. I've been in this job long enough to know exactly what I'm doing." His grip on her arm tightened, as though to emphasize his control. "Let's see you explain that necklace to the folks at the station." As they reached the car, the murmurs of the small crowd grew louder. A few bolder onlookers exchanged glances, their unease evident. Some reached for their phones, snapping pictures or recording videos of the scene. Ethan noticed but paid them no mind, too absorbed in asserting his dominance. CHIS, by law, preceded the process of extracy. Sophia, despite the indignity of her treatment, remained poised. As Ethan opened the car door, she turned to him, her voice as steady as it had been from the beginning. "Remember this moment, Officer Harper, because when the truth comes to light, you'll have to answer for what you've done." Ethan smirked, shaking his head as he motioned for her to get into the car. "Save it for someone who cares," he muttered. "You're not as untouchable as you think." As the door slammed shut behind her, Sophia took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had done everything she could to maintain her dignity and assert her innocence, but now she placed her trust in Michael and the system he worked so hard to uphold. The weight of the situation didn't escape her. but neither did her resolve. Ethan got into the driver's seat, turning the key with a sharp twist. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he glanced back at Sophia through the rearview mirror, his expression a mix of satisfaction and contempt. Unbeknownst to him, a signal had already reached the station. Michael, reading the alert on his device, was already on his way. The patrol car pulled into the street, leaving behind a crowd of unsettled witnesses and a growing sense that this confrontation was only the beginning. The fluorescent lights of the station buzzed faintly as Ethan strode in, dragging Sophia along with him. The atmosphere inside was relatively quiet, with officers stationed at desks, typing up reports or answering phones. Ethan's entrance disrupted the calm, his voice echoing across the room. "Look what I brought in," he announced smugly, gesturing toward Sophia as though she were a trophy. "A classic case. Someone walking around with stolen jewelry, acting all high and mighty." Sophia stood silently beside him, her calm presence in stark contrast to Ethan's overinflated sense of importance. She surveyed the room, her composed demeanor unbroken despite the humiliation of being paraded like a criminal. Her silence, however, spoke volumes, and it didn't take long for the officers in the room to pick up on the tension. One of the younger officers, James, frowned as he looked up from his desk. His uniform was neat, his demeanor thoughtful, and he seemed to hesitate before speaking. "Ethan," he said cautiously, "are you sure about this? Any evidence or reports that match her description?" Ethan dismissed the question with a wave of his hand, his confidence unwavering. "Don't need evidence," he replied with a scoff. "Look at that necklace. It screams stolen. Someone like her walking around with something like that? It doesn't add up." James's frown deepened. But before he could press further, the station door opened with a sharp swing. Michael entered, his commanding presence drawing immediate attention. His face was a mask of cold fury, his jaw tight as he scanned the room. Officers instinctively straightened in their seats, recognizing the gravity of his expression. Michael's voice was low but ice-cold as he addressed the room. "I want to know why my wife has been arrested without cause." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Ethan froze mid-step, his smirk vanishing instantly. His eyes darted from Michael to Sophia and back again, disbelief clouding his features. Your wife?" he stammered, his voice suddenly uncertain. Michael stepped closer, his movements deliberate, the weight of his authority pressing down on everyone in the room. "Yes, my wife," he said, enunciating each word with measured precision. His voice, though controlled, carried a dangerous edge. "Explain yourself." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his confidence now replaced with visible unease. He opened his mouth to speak, fumbling for words. "Captain," he began hesitantly, "she couldn't prove the necklace was hers, and her attitude—" Michael's hand came up sharply, cutting Ethan off mid-sentence. "Her attitude?" he repeated, his tone filled with disbelief. His eyes locked onto Ethan's, and the room fell into an almost suffocating silence. "You arrested her because you didn't like her attitude? Is that your understanding of the law, Officer Harper?" Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of Michael's gaze bearing down on him. He tried to muster a response, but no words came. Around the room, the other officers exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort evident. Even James, who had questioned Ethan earlier, looked down at his desk, unwilling to meet Michael's eyes. Michael's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Our job," he began, his tone growing sharper with each word, "is to uphold justice, not to abuse power, not to humiliate or demean, and certainly not to target someone based on your personal prejudices." Ethan flinched as Michael's words landed with the force of a hammer. The tension in the room was palpable, the other officers visibly uneasy as Michael continued. "You have violated professional ethics. You have dishonored this department, and worst of all, you have targeted an innocent woman because of your own biases." He stepped closer to Ethan, his voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. "Do you even understand what you've done? You've not only abused your authority, but you've also tarnished the trust this department is supposed to have with the community." Ethan looked down, his face flushed with shame. The weight of Michael's words left no room for excuses, no avenue for justification. He opened his mouth to speak, but Michael's steely gaze stopped him. Michael turned away from Ethan and addressed the room, his voice loud enough for every officer to hear. "Let this be a lesson to everyone. We do not tolerate abuse of power in this department. We do not tolerate prejudice. If anyone here thinks they are above the law or their actions will go unchecked, think again." He turned back to Ethan, his expression unyielding. "Harper, you've overstepped, and there will be consequences." Michael's voice softened just slightly as he finally turned to Sophia. His tone shifted, no longer icy but filled with quiet concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his words meant for her alone. Sophia met his gaze, her calm expression now tinged with a small smile. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. "But I think you have some work to do here." Michael gave a small nod, his respect for her unspoken but evident. Turning back to Ethan, his tone regained its steel. "This ends now. Take her out of those cuffs." Ethan hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled with the keys. The click of the handcuffs being removed felt like the closing of a chapter, one that left Ethan visibly shaken and the rest of the room deeply introspective. Sophia rubbed her wrists gently, her composure intact. Michael addressed the officers one last time, his voice firm. "Let this serve as a reminder of why we wear this badge. To protect and serve, not to harm or belittle. If anyone here needs a refresher on that, my door is always open." The weight of his words lingered as the room fell silent. Ethan stood frozen, his face pale as Michael turned to him one last time. "You'll answer for this, Harper," he said quietly, but firmly. "Count on it." With that, Michael gently guided Sophia out of the station, leaving behind a room filled with silence, shame, and the unmistakable realization that justice had been served. The heavy clang of the holding cell door echoed through the station as Michael strode down the corridor with purposeful steps. His expression was resolute, his eyes locked on the one figure that mattered most: Sophia. Behind the bars she stood with her usual poise, her shoulders back, her calm demeanor unshaken. The faintest trace of a smile played on her lips, as though she knew that this moment was simply another obstacle to be overcome. Michael approached the cell, his key ring jangling softly in the tense quiet. Without a word, he inserted the key and turned it, the lock clicking open. He pushed the door aside, stepping inside with the same controlled authority he carried everywhere. "Are you all right, Sophia?" he asked gently, his voice softer than it had been earlier in the main room. His eyes scanned her face, searching for any sign of distress. Sophia's calm smile widened slightly, her eyes meeting his with reassurance. "I'm fine," she replied, her tone steady but tinged with quiet humor. "But I think you need to teach some people here a lesson." Michael let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sigh. "That's exactly what I intend to do," he said, his tone a mix of determination and exasperation. He stepped back, allowing Sophia to exit the cell. Though she moved with the same grace she always did, Michael could sense the weight of the experience lingering. He placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, a subtle gesture of solidarity before turning his attention to the room beyond. With a commanding presence, Michael called out to the officers watching from the desks and hallways. "Harper!" His voice rang with authority, silencing the murmur of whispers that had been spreading through the station. Ethan, who had been lingering near the front desk, flinched at the sound of his name. His face was pale and his hands fidgeted nervously at his sides as he turned toward Michael. The tension in the air was palpable as he shuffled forward, the swagger he had displayed earlier entirely gone. Michael's expression became more anxious as he approached, and his massive body weight settled. Michael gestured to Sophia's wrists, where the marks from the cuffs were faint but unmistakable. "Take the cuffs off her," he ordered, his tone sharp and uncompromising. "Now!" Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting between Michael and Sophia. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the key at his belt. Yes, Captain," he stammered, fumbling as he unlocked the cuffs. Sophia stood still as Ethan awkwardly removed the restraints, her expression neutral but with an unmistakable air of quiet strength. Once the cuffs were gone, she rubbed her wrists gently and stepped back, holding her composure with the same dignity she had displayed throughout. Michael stepped closer to Ethan, his towering presence forcing the younger officer to look up. "This station," Michael began, his voice carrying a cold edge, "is built on trust, integrity, and justice. You've managed to undermine all three in a single afternoon." Ethan's mouth opened as though to respond, but no words came. Michael didn't give him the chance to recover. "Your actions today were an abuse of power," Michael continued, his voice growing louder so that everyone in the station could hear. "They were rooted in prejudice and arrogance, not in evidence or the pursuit of justice. That is unacceptable." The other officers stood frozen, their expressions a mix of unease and guilt. Even those who hadn't been involved couldn't escape the weight of Michael's reprimand. His words weren't just meant for Ethan. They were a reminder to everyone of the standards they were expected to uphold. Michael turned away from Ethan and addressed the entire room. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," he said, his voice unwavering. "There is no place for bias or abuse of power in this department. None. If any of you think otherwise, you are not fit to wear this badge." The silence that followed was deafening. Officers shifted uncomfortably in their places, some looking down at their desks, others staring straight ahead as though afraid to meet Michael's gaze. The weight of his words hung in the air, their gravity impossible to ignore. Michael returned his focus to Ethan, his tone sharp and final. "There will be consequences for your actions, Officer Harper. Count on that." Ethan's face flushed, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "Captain, he began, but Michael raised a hand to silence him. "This isn't the time for excuses," Michael said firmly. "You'll have plenty of opportunities to reflect on your behavior in the days ahead." Turning back to Sophia, Michael's expression softened once again. He extended his arm, and she took it without hesitation. Together, they walked toward the station's exit, their united front a silent declaration of strength and resilience. As they left, the sound of the heavy door closing behind them felt symbolic, a definitive end to the injustice Sophia had faced. The officers left behind stood in uneasy silence, absorbing the weight of what had transpired. The lesson was clear, and for some, it was a much-needed wake-up call. Outside, as they stepped into the fresh air, Michael paused and looked at Sophia. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. Sophia gave him a small, knowing smile. "You handled it exactly as I knew you would," she replied. "Now, let's go home." Michael nodded, his resolve strengthened by her unwavering support. Together they walked away, leaving the station and its troubled undercurrents behind, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The next morning, the air in the station was heavy with anticipation. News of the previous day's events had spread quickly, and the officers were bracing for the fallout. Ethan sat at his desk, his hands clasped tightly, staring blankly at the cluttered paperwork in front of him. The usual hum of activity felt distant as he replayed the confrontation with Michael in his mind. He knew this was far from over. Michael's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Officer Harper, my office, now." Ethan's heart sank as he stood, his movements stiff and mechanical. He followed Michael down the hallway, the eyes of his colleagues boring into him as he passed. The closed door of Michael's office felt like a looming finality. Once inside, Michael shut the door with deliberate firmness and gestured for Ethan to sit. The weight of the moment pressed down on both men, though Michael's expression remained unreadable. Michael leaned against his desk, his arms crossed over his chest, his piercing gaze fixed on Ethan. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" he asked, his tone measured but firm. "Huh?" Aunt Nancy asked, crinkling her nose. "Shh! How many visits do you have?" Ethan hesitated, his voice catching in his throat. "Captain, I made a mistake. I didn't mean to." The wording was blurred as Ethan reached into his pocket. "Stop!" Michael interrupted, his voice sharper now. "This isn't about what you meant, it's about what you did. You abused your authority, acted on bias, and arrested an innocent person without evidence. That's not a mistake, Harper. That's a violation of everything this department stands for." Ethan looked down at his hands, the reality of Michael's words sinking in. "I've served here for over 10 years, he said quietly, almost pleading. "I've made sacrifices, worked cases, put my life on the line. I never thought. But for just as dark a time to start the process as there would be for most people." Michael's tone remained unyielding as he cut him off again. "This isn't about your years of service. It's about accountability. No amount of time on the force excuses what you did yesterday. You let your prejudice guide your actions, and that is unacceptable." Words landed like blows, each one striking Ethan's pride and defenses. He wanted to argue, to explain himself, but deep down, he knew Michael was right. He had let his biases cloud his judgment, and now he was facing the consequences. Michael straightened, his expression resolute. "Effective immediately. You are suspended. Surrender your badge and gun." Ethan's head shot up, his face pale with shock. "Captain, please," he said, his voice cracking. "Don't do this. I can do better. Just give me a chance to prove it." Michael's eyes narrowed, his voice unwavering. "This isn't a punishment for the sake of punishment, Harper. It's an opportunity, one I suggest you take seriously. If you want a second chance, you'll complete 6 months of mandatory anti-racism training and therapy. You will address your biases, learn from your mistakes, and demonstrate that you've changed. If you can't or won't do that, you'll never wear this uniform again." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Ethan's shoulders slumped, his defenses crumbling under the weight of Michael's words. Slowly, he reached for his badge and gun, the symbols of his authority that now felt like burdens. He placed them on Michael's desk, his hands trembling. I'll do it," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely audible. "I'll take the training. I'll go to therapy, whatever it takes." Michael studied him for a moment, his gaze piercing yet unreadable. Finally, he nodded, though his expression remained stern. "Good. But understand this. Change isn't about checking boxes or going through the motions. It's about real growth, real accountability. You need to confront not just what you did, but why you did it." Ethan nodded, though his shame was evident. "I understand," he said, his voice hollow. Michael's tone softened, though it lost none of its authority. "This isn't an easy road, Harper, but it's a necessary one. And if you're not willing to take it seriously, you won't find a place here, or anywhere in law enforcement." The room fell silent for a moment, the gravity of Michael's words settling between them. Ethan felt exposed, his pride and ego stripped away, leaving only the raw truth of his actions. It wasn't just about saving his career. It was about facing the man he had become and deciding who he wanted to be moving forward. "Dismissed," Michael said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Ethan stood slowly, his steps unsteady as he turned to leave. At the door, he paused, glancing back at Michael. "Thank you," he said hesitantly, his voice thick with emotion. Michael didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured but resolute. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you've earned it." Ethan nodded once before stepping out of the office, the door closing behind him with a soft click. As he walked through the station, the weight of his suspension settled on his shoulders. His colleagues avoided his gaze, the unspoken judgment heavy in the air. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like a stranger in his own workplace. But as he left the station and stepped into the crisp morning air, a flicker of something stirred within him. It wasn't hope, not yet, but the faint recognition that this could be a turning point. If he was willing to face the truth about himself, he might be able to rebuild not just his career, but the respect he had lost. The sterile yet inviting office of Dr. Patel felt unfamiliar to Ethan as he sat on the comfortable couch, his posture rigid, hands clasped tightly in his lap. The room was softly lit, its warm tones and gentle decor designed to ease tension. But for Ethan, the tension came from within. He had spent years projecting authority and confidence, yet here, faced with his own reflection in the figurative mirror of therapy, he felt exposed. Dr. Patel, seated across from him in a high-backed chair, regarded him with a calm, patient demeanor. Her notebook rested on her lap, though she hadn't written much. She waited, allowing the silence to invite Ethan to speak. "I don't know where to start," Ethan admitted, his voice low and uncertain. Dr. Patel tilted her head slightly, her tone gentle but probing. "Why don't we begin with what brought you here?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I messed up," he said after a moment, his voice tight. "I let my assumptions, my biases, get in the way of doing my job, and now I'm here because—" He paused, struggling to articulate what he barely understood himself. "Because I don't want to be that person anymore." Dr. Patel nodded, her expression encouraging. "That's a good start. Recognizing there's a problem is the first step to addressing it. Can you tell me where you think those biases came from?" Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the edge of the couch. It's how I grew up," he admitted reluctantly. "In my house, people like her were always looked down on. My parents, my uncles, my neighbors, they'd say things, make jokes. I never questioned it, it was just normal." His voice faltered, the weight of his words pressing down on him. He looked up at Dr. Patel, as though bracing for judgment, but her gaze remained steady and compassionate. "Are you ready to question it now?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening with determination. "I have to," he said, his voice firm despite the emotion threatening to break through. "I can't live like this anymore. I can't keep letting those old voices dictate how I see the world." He rolled over, slowly rolling towards Catherine, who was still sleeping with her eyes closed. Dr. Patel leaned forward slightly, her pen poised. "That's an important realization, Ethan. Understanding the roots of your biases is the foundation for change. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. What do you feel when you think about those voices from your past?" "What voice?" Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping. "Shame," he said quietly, "and anger. At them, but mostly at myself, for not questioning it, for letting it shape who I became." Dr. Patel gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. Shame and anger are natural responses when we confront parts of ourselves we're not proud of, but they can also be powerful motivators for change. Let's focus on what you can do moving forward. For weeks, Ethan returned to these sessions, peeling back the layers of his upbringing and confronting the biases that had festered unnoticed for so long. Dr. Patel guided him through moments of clarity, helping him recognize the difference between the person he had been and the person he wanted to become. One evening, after an especially challenging session, Dr. Patel gave Ethan an assignment to write a letter to his past self. Sometimes, she explained, we need to address the person we were to fully embrace the person we're becoming. That night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, a blank sheet of paper before him. The pen felt heavy in his hand as he struggled to find the words. Slowly, they began to flow. Dear younger me, you thought you were doing your job, but you were hurting people. You let your assumptions guide your actions, and you didn't stop to ask why. You thought that wearing a badge made you right, but it only made your wrongs more visible. I know why you are the way you are. I know you grew up hearing voices that told you who to trust and who to doubt, who belonged and who didn't. I know you didn't question it, because questioning it felt impossible. But those voices were wrong. And so were you. You can't change the past. You can't undo the harm you caused or the trust you broke. But you can build a better future. You can choose to be better, to see people for who they are, not for what those voices taught you to see. It's not too late to start. This isn't going to be easy. Change never is. But you owe it to yourself and to the people you hurt to try. Sincerely, the person you're becoming. As he set the pen down, Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions. There was shame, yes, but also a flicker of hope. The letter wasn't just an apology to his past self. It was a promise to his future. In his next session, Ethan shared the letter with Dr. Patel. She listened intently, nodding as he read. That, she said when he finished, is the beginning of real change. Though the road ahead was still long, Ethan felt lighter. For the first time, he began to see that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about owning it, learning from it, and doing better moving forward. Months had passed since Ethan's suspension and the start of his mandated training in therapy. The once overconfident officer was no longer the same man. Therapy had forced him to confront his prejudices, and training had taught him the value of empathy and accountability. But Ethan knew that true change required more than internal work. It had to be reflected outwardly in his actions. As part of his rehabilitation, Ethan began participating in community seminars on systemic bias and justice reform. These events were hosted in libraries, community centers, and schools attended by residents of Greenville and neighboring towns. Ethan was hesitant at first, knowing he would have to face both the skepticism of his peers and the pain of those his actions had harmed. But he also understood this was an essential step in his journey. One bright Saturday afternoon, Ethan stood at the front of a packed community center. The room buzzed with murmurs as attendees settled into their seats. Faces from all walks of life filled the space. Community leaders, young activists, families, and even some of his fellow officers. Among them were Sandra and Hector, two individuals whose lives had been deeply affected by bias and policing. Ethan adjusted the microphone, his hands trembling slightly. Taking a deep breath, he began. "Thank you all for being here today," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I'm not standing here as someone who has all the answers or who has fixed all my flaws. I'm standing here as someone who has made mistakes, serious mistakes, and is working to make amends." The crowd fell silent, the gravity of his words settling over the room. "For a long time," Ethan continued, "I believed my biases were truths. I didn't question them because I thought they were just part of the job, part of how the world worked. But I was wrong. Justice isn't about assumptions or stereotypes. It's about listening, understanding, and treating everyone with the dignity they deserve." He paused, scanning the faces before him. Some were skeptical, arms crossed and brows furrowed. Others appeared curious, leaning forward as they listened. But what mattered most to Ethan was that they were there, willing to engage. "I want to be honest with you," he said. Change didn't come easily for me. It took hard conversations, hours of therapy, and facing truths about myself that I didn't want to admit. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that change is possible, if you're willing to confront yourself and do the work. Ethan's words hung in the air as Sandra rose from her seat, a quiet strength in her presence. She was a local educator who had long been an advocate for equity in the community. Taking the microphone, she turned to the audience. "I've been on the receiving end of bias," Sandra said, her voice calm but firm. "It's painful, it's infuriating, and for a long time I didn't believe people like Ethan could change. But here he is, standing in front of us, admitting his mistakes and working to make things right. That doesn't erase the harm, but it proves that change is possible if you're willing to confront yourself." The room erupted in murmurs of agreement, a shift in the atmosphere as Sandra's words resonated with the crowd. Hector, a young man who had been wrongfully detained years ago in a case that drew community outrage, stood next. His voice carried a quiet vulnerability as he addressed the audience. "I've seen the damage bias can do," he said. "It broke my trust in the system, but seeing someone like Ethan take responsibility for his actions, it gives me hope. Hope that we can push for real reform. Hope that things can get better." Ethan listened, humbled by their words. He knew their support wasn't about absolving him. It was about holding him accountable and recognizing the effort he was making. Another voice called out. As the seminar continued, Ethan answered questions, shared insights from his training, and engaged in difficult but meaningful conversations with attendees. The skepticism in the room gradually softened, replaced by a cautious optimism. The community was beginning to see that Ethan's journey wasn't just about personal redemption. It was a step toward building trust and fostering change. By the end of the session, Ethan felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced before. This wasn't about undoing the past. He knew that was impossible. It was about moving forward with integrity, using his story to inspire dialogue and action. As the crowd began to disperse, Sandra approached Ethan. "It takes courage to do what you're doing," she said, her tone sincere. "Don't stop." Hector nodded beside her. "Keep pushing, man. People need to see that change isn't just talk, it's action." Ethan thanked them, their words fueling his resolve. As he left the center that day, he realized his journey wasn't just about rebuilding his own life. It was about helping others believe that change, though difficult, was always within reach. The late evening air was crisp as Ethan approached Michael and Sophia's home. The house was modest but welcoming, its front porch illuminated by the soft glow of a hanging light. Ethan hesitated at the door, his nerves tightening in his chest. Though he had faced countless challenges during his journey of accountability, this moment felt particularly daunting. Tonight, he wasn't addressing a crowd or sitting in a therapy session. He was confronting the people he had wronged most directly. He raised his hand and knocked lightly. A few moments later, the door opened to reveal Sophia. She stood with her usual calm grace, her warm expression tinged with a hint of reserve. "Hello, Ethan," she said, her voice steady but kind. "Please, come in." Ethan nodded, stepping inside. "Thank you for having me," he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of genuine gratitude. The scent of something savory lingered in the air, and the dining table in the next room was set simply but thoughtfully. Ethan noticed the details, the neatly folded napkins, the warm glow of the candles, small touches that made the space feel welcoming despite the seriousness of the occasion. Michael appeared from the living room, his expression serious but not unkind. He nodded to Ethan, gesturing toward the dining table. "Have a seat," he said. "But let's be clear, this isn't a celebration, it's a chance to talk." Ethan swallowed hard, his nerves amplifying the gravity of Michael's words. He nodded, taking a seat across from Sophia and Michael. The silence that followed wasn't hostile, but it was heavy with unspoken emotions. Ethan took a deep breath, meeting Sophia's gaze first. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "What I did to you, there's no excuse for it. I acted on assumptions and prejudice, and I abused the power that I was trusted with. I know I can't erase the harm I caused, but I promise you, I will never let something like that happen again." Sophia studied him for a moment, her expression softening. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the weight of the burden he had been carrying. She nodded slightly, a small smile forming on her lips. "Thank you, Ethan," she said. "It takes courage to admit when you've done wrong. But remember, change isn't a moment, it's a journey." Ethan nodded, her words resonating deeply. "I understand that now," he said. "And I'm committed to that journey, no matter how long it takes." Michael leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "You've made progress, Ethan. I've seen it in the way you've handled yourself these past months. But words and intentions aren't enough. You have to back them up with action, every day. The trust you broke isn't just with Sophia or me, it's with the entire community." Ethan nodded again, his expression resolute. "I know. And I'll keep working to rebuild that trust, not just for my own sake, but because it's the right thing to do." The conversation shifted, the tension gradually giving way to a more natural rhythm. They spoke about the changes Ethan had been working on, the challenges he'd faced in therapy, and the moments of growth he had experienced. Sophia listened intently, her thoughtful questions reflecting her genuine interest in understanding his journey. As dinner progressed, the atmosphere grew lighter. Michael's stern demeanor softened, though his authority remained evident. It was clear he wasn't offering forgiveness lightly. He was watching Ethan closely, ensuring his sincerity matched his words. When the plates were cleared and the evening wound down, Sophia walked Ethan to the door. She paused before opening it, her gaze steady. "This dinner wasn't easy for any of us," she said. "But I'm glad you came." Ethan met her eyes, a hint of gratitude flickering in his expression. "I'm glad you invited me," he said. "Thank you for giving me the chance to say what I needed to say." Sophia smiled faintly, her voice calm but firm. "This is just one step, Ethan. There will be many more ahead." Ethan nodded. "I'll take them," he said, "one at a time." As he stepped out into the cool night air, Ethan felt a sense of quiet relief. It wasn't forgiveness he had earned tonight. It was the chance to keep proving himself. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. Inside, Sophia returned to the table where Michael was finishing his coffee. She sat across from him, her expression thoughtful. "What do you think?" she asked. Michael considered for a moment, then nodded. "He's trying," he said simply. "And for now, that's enough." Sophia smiled, their shared understanding a silent affirmation of what they both knew to be true. Change was a journey, and Ethan was finally walking it. The atmosphere at the police station had shifted noticeably since Ethan's suspension and subsequent return. Officers who once regarded him with skepticism now watched with cautious respect. The changes in Ethan were undeniable, not just in his demeanor but in his actions. He had become a quiet yet firm advocate for fairness, often speaking up during discussions about policy and behavior. The region was still a hot site for performers and athletes feeling that they were being criticized, and the audience was salt and pepper. His transformation was most evident in the way he approached his new role, leading mandatory diversity and inclusion training for new recruits. One morning, Ethan stood at the front of the training room, his posture confident but approachable. Rows of fresh-faced recruits sat before him, their attention divided between curiosity and the inherent tension of their first days in uniform. Behind them, a projector displayed a simple slide: justice through respect. Ethan cleared his throat and began. "When I started my career, I thought justice was about one thing: enforcing the law. I thought if I followed the rule book, I'd be doing my job. But I was wrong." His voice was steady, each word deliberate. "Justice isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about respecting every person's dignity. It's about understanding the weight of the power we carry and using it responsibly. The recruits listened intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and reflection. Ethan paced the room, his tone growing more earnest. There was a time when I didn't understand this. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. I thought I knew who people were just by looking at them. I was wrong then, and I've spent a lot of time unlearning those mistakes. He paused, meeting the eyes of the recruits. Your badge doesn't make you better than anyone else. It doesn't make you immune to mistakes. It doesn't give you the right to disrespect the people you're meant to serve. The moment you forget that, you stop being a protector and start being part of the problem. A hand shot up in the second row. Officer Harper, a young woman asked tentatively, "How did you turn it around? I mean, how did you face what you'd done?" Ethan stopped, considering her question. "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "It took humility, honesty, and a lot of uncomfortable conversations. But most of all, it took listening. Listening to people I'd wronged, people I'd misjudged, and people who had every reason not to trust me. It's not about erasing the past. It's about doing better every day. It's not just about problems to be solved. It's about coming comfortable with confronting the truth about what's happening." As the session ended, Michael stood in the back, arms crossed, watching quietly. When the recruits filed out, he approached Ethan, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Ethan grinned and tapped his legs together. "You've come a long way," Michael said, his voice low but firm. "But remember, this journey never ends." Ethan nodded, his respect for Michael evident. "I know," he said, "and I'll keep walking it." Several weeks later, Ethan found himself standing on a stage at the annual Greenville Community Awards. The event hall was filled with residents, civic leaders, and officers, all gathered to celebrate individuals who had made significant contributions to the town. When Ethan's name was called for the Community Transformation Award, a ripple of applause spread through the crowd. Ethan stepped to the podium, the plaque in his hands feeling heavier than it looked. The applause quieted, leaving him alone with the microphone and the weight of the moment. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady but reflective. "Standing here today, I'm not just thinking about what I've done to get here. I'm thinking about what I've done to others that brought me to this point in the first place." "I've thought about that." The audience grew silent, hanging on his words. "This award isn't about my past," he continued. "It's not about what I've already done. It's a reminder of the work ahead. Change isn't a destination, it's a path. It's something you choose every day, in every interaction, in every decision." He glanced out into the audience, his gaze catching Sandra and Hector, who had been instrumental in supporting his journey. They nodded in quiet encouragement, their expressions a blend of pride and hope. "I've learned that change starts with listening," Ethan said. "Listening to the people who've been hurt, the people who've been ignored, and the people who are brave enough to demand better. It starts with recognizing that we can all do better." The applause that followed was loud and sustained, a mix of acknowledgement and respect. Ethan stepped back from the podium, scanning the faces in the crowd. This wasn't just his moment. It was a collective one, a reflection of how communities could come together to confront hard truths and move forward. As the evening concluded, Michael approached Ethan, extending a hand. "You've earned this," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won respect. "Thank you," Ethan replied, his handshake firm but humble. "But this is just the beginning." Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Good, because we're counting on you to lead the way." Ethan walked out into the cool night air, the plaque under his arm. He knew that while recognition was meaningful, it wasn't the goal. The real work was ongoing, and he was ready to continue. For himself, for the community, and for the future he now believed in. The police station in Greenville had changed. What once felt rigid and closed off now hummed with a renewed sense of purpose and openness. Officers no longer merely saw their work as enforcing the law, they saw it as a partnership with the people they served. And at the center of this transformation was Ethan Harper. Ethan had embraced his role as a mentor to both rookies and seasoned officers. His workshops were a cornerstone of the department's new approach to justice, emphasizing empathy, fairness, and accountability. He spoke not as a man who had all the answers, but as someone who had made mistakes and worked to learn from them. In one such workshop, a diverse group of officers sat in a semicircle, notebooks and pens in hand. Ethan stood at the front, his stance relaxed but his words purposeful. He questioned each. "We're all responsible," he began, his tone both firm and reflective, "for keeping the path of change open, for ourselves and for each other. That means challenging what we think we know every single day." He paused, letting his words settle. "I used to think that the job was about control, about being in charge. But I've learned that it's not about control. It's about connection. It's about understanding that every person we meet has a story, just like we do. And if we fail to respect that, we fail as officers and as people." The room was silent, the weight of his words palpable. Ethan looked around, seeing the thoughtful expressions of those before him. "The badge doesn't make us better," he said softly. "It gives us the opportunity to do better, to serve, not dominate, to listen, not judge, to protect, not harm. Soon it will fall to us to be it." One officer raised her hand. "But how do we make that real? Outside of this room, in the heat of the moment?" Ethan nodded, appreciating the honesty of the question. "By remembering this," he said, gesturing to the room, "that we're not alone. Change isn't a solitary journey. It's something we do together. We hold each other accountable. We challenge each other to grow. And when we make mistakes, and we will, we own them, learn from them, and do better." We open. The workshop ended with a standing ovation, not for Ethan as a person, but for the shared vision he had helped cultivate. Officers left with a sense of purpose, their roles as protectors and community members more intertwined than ever. In the months that followed, Greenville began to change. The relationship between the police and the community shifted from one of tension to one of collaboration. Officers were seen walking the streets, chatting with shop owners, attending neighborhood events, and listening to concerns, not as enforcers, but as partners. One afternoon, Ethan visited a local high school to speak with students about justice and fairness. After his talk, a young boy approached him, clutching a notebook. "Officer Harper," he said shyly, "do you think people can really change?" Ethan crouched down to meet the boy's eye level. "I don't just think it," he said with a small smile. "I know it. But it's not easy. Change takes time, effort, and a willingness to face hard truths. But it's worth it." I'm sure it does," muttered Adam, exhausted by what he was about within him. The boy nodded, his expression thoughtful as he clutched his notebook tighter. "I want to help people," he said. "Like you." Ethan's smile deepened, the boy's words reminding him why he had committed to this path. "Then start by listening," Ethan said. "To your friends, your family, your neighbors. Listening is where it all begins." Years later, Greenville became known as a model of justice and unity. Other towns sent representatives to learn from its policies and community-driven initiatives. Ethan's story, once one of failure, became an example of redemption and responsibility. At a final workshop, Ethan addressed a packed room of officers, community members, and leaders from neighboring towns. His voice, steady and calm, carried a message that resonated deeply. "Change doesn't have a finish line," he said. "It's not something you achieve once and then stop thinking about. It's a continuous journey, one we walk together. Because if we don't, we risk falling back into old patterns." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "And here's the truth. The work of justice is hard. It asks us to confront our own flaws, to challenge the way things have always been. But it also gives us the chance to build something better, something worth believing in." As he stepped away from the podium, the room erupted into applause. But what stayed with the attendees most wasn't the sound of clapping. It was the echo of Ethan's words, leaving them to consider a lingering, powerful question. What will you do to keep the path of change open? And in that question lay the story's legacy, a call to action for everyone to become part of a journey that would never truly end.